Good morning. The first item of business is general questions, and at question number 1 I call Tess White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking ahead of the festive period to support poultry farms in light of the potential threat of avian flu.
Minister Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Since the commencement of the current avian influenza outbreak, the Scottish Government has continued to promote best practice biosecurity measures for keepers designed to protect their poultry premises from highly pathogenic avian influenza. The Scottish Government has robust and tested contingency plans, and where outbreaks have occurred, the Government's response has been immediate, with all appropriate disease control measures and veterinary investigations applied with the aim of preventing further spread of the virus. Owners impacted have received guidance and support, including financial compensation.
Tess White.
There have been 5 outbreaks of avian flu in Aberdeenshire since July, and earlier this month 1,500 birds were killed near Peterhead. It's no wonder NFU Scotland has described the situation as very worrying and that it remains a serious concern. Will the Minister reassure poultry farmers that all safeguards against avian flu will be considered by the Scottish Government ahead of the festive period, including housing orders for commercial stocks? Thank you.
Minister.
I want to thank Tess White for her interest in this area. It is extremely serious, and the risk to wild birds and to poultry is constantly monitored and assessed by scientific and technical experts and reviewed on a weekly basis, jointly by the Chief Veterinary Officers of the UK. The risk in wild bird remains high, while the risk to poultry is currently low, but biosecurity plays a crucial part in that assessment and is the single most important factor under the controls of bird keepers. Biosecurity will be particularly important as the uncertainty rises as we enter the winter period. Tess White's absolutely right in that. It has actually been quite unusual for us to have avian flu in the summer months, so we are entering a period of a return of migratory birds, so that it increases the risk. If the risk to poultry from wild birds increases to a certain level, Scottish ministers may consider the introduction of mandatory biosecurity measures through the declaration of an avian influenza prevention zone, and the Scottish Government provides advice on how to maintain good biosecurity standards on its website.
Thank you. Question number 2, Ivan McKee.
To ask the Scottish Government when it will announce funding for its innovation centres.
Cabinet Secretary Jenny Ruth.
Scotland's Innovation Centre programme forms an important part of Scotland's knowledge exchange and innovation ecosystem by enhancing innovation and entrepreneurship across Scotland's key economic sectors. For Phase 2 of the programme, £80 million has been invested by the Scottish Government via the Scottish Funding Council and enterprise agencies, which will support the innovation centres until 2024. I am advised by my officials that the SFC have carried out an assessment process to determine future funding. This will ensure the sustainability of the Innovation Centre programme in the long term and maximise the value public investment delivers to the research and innovation landscape. I am advised that the SFC updated centres on the outcome of the assessment process on Friday the 22nd of September. Now the assessment is complete, SFC and other funders will work with the centres on the next steps.
Ivan McKee.
Thank the CabSec for that answer. As she indicated, Scotland's innovation centres are a critical part of our economic landscape, as recognised in the Government's innovation strategy. They support economic development in key sectors where Scotland has a genuine competitive advantage, including precision medicine, aquaculture, industrial biotechnology and sensor technology. I suppose I'm slightly concerned as an Education Minister rather than an Economy Minister answering this question, and whether that indicates that the Government regards innovation centres as an academic rather than an industrial asset. So what reassurance can the Minister or the CabSec give that a coherent economic strategy and the imperative to press home our global advantage in key sectors will inform any decisions made on the future of innovation centres?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for his question. As he knows, Scotland's innovation strategy outlines the critical role that he's alluded to in the further and higher education sectors that they play in promoting innovation, and I recognise additionally that the funding is provided by the Scottish Funding Councils, which is why the response today comes from me as Education Secretary. More broadly, of course, our innovation centres do build that transformational collaboration between business, university, colleges and others to capitalise on Scotland's world reading research. To my mind, that's not a binary education or economy matter, because the two are inherently linked. The SFC assessment process looked at alignment with the national strategies and priorities, including the Innovation Strategy and the National Strategy for Economic Transformation. This is designed to ensure innovation centres continue to operate not as either industry or academic assets, as the member has alluded to, but rather truly national assets to maximise impact for Scotland. Notwithstanding, I am due to meet with the SSC shortly, and I will ensure that coherence that Mr McKee talks to is at the heart of the decision-making process.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week at the Economy Committee, Professor Sir Mike Ferguson from Dundee highlighted the issue of innovation in the life sciences sector, but also expressed his concern that start-ups in that sector were having real difficulties in accessing capital. And he said that he could see a role for the Scottish National Investment Bank in providing that capital. Is that something that the Cabinet Secretary would agree with?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for his question. I suspect a response may be better suited to an Economy Minister, and I will ask the suitable Minister to write to the member.
Question number 3, Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the rollout of the Scottish Education Exchange Programme Initial Test and Learn project this year.
Cabinet Secretary Jenny Gilruth.
Over the summer, officials have been working with partners across the education sector to develop the Test and Learn project of the Scottish Education Exchange Programme. This programme is intended to replace some aspects of the Erasmus Plus programme as a hard Brexit supported by Westminster parties continues to rob young people in Scotland of opportunities. The Test and Learn project will open for applications in October. The Minister for Further and Higher Education wrote to the Education and Children and Young People Committee yesterday with more detailed information on the programme.
Rona Mackay.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Can the Cabinet Secretary assure Bishopbriggs Academy in my constituency of support to continue their German educational trainee programme, considering the impact of Brexit, the withdrawal of Erasmus and with visa challenges for the academic year 2023 to 24? Additionally, would she be open to meeting with the school staff for further discussion on this?
Cabinet Secretary.
I know the German educational trainee programme has been a really valuable resource to a number of schools. Languages assistants themselves are, of course, a tremendous asset for our schools, and we know they enrich language and cultural learning, and they also encourage our young people to widen their cultural horizons. But, of course, as I alluded to, Presiding Officer, the UK Government's disastrous hard Brexit means we now have less language assistants in our schools, and it's also harder for our school pupils to go on school exchanges with the ending of free movement, for example. The impact of Brexit continues to curtail opportunities for young people in Scotland and across the UK. And we know that Scotland benefited hugely from Erasmus+, for example, with proportionately more students from Scotland taking part in Erasmus than from any other country in the UK. I very much hope that a long-term solution can be found to allow schools to continue their work with GET in the future, and I would be more than happy to visit Bishopbriggs Academy in Ms Mackay's constituency to further understand the importance of the GET programme and to make direct representations to the UK Education Secretary on this matter.
Willie Rennie.
Before the SNP get too carried away with this is £1 million compared with the Welsh programme, which is £65 million. Surely this is just a fig leaf to hide the embarrassment of the SNP and their failure to deliver on the replacement of Erasmus.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for his question, and of course we will engage with our Welsh colleagues, as I know the committee has, directly on that matter. But I do find it somewhat perplexing that Mr Rennie, whose party now supports a hard Brexit, as I understand it, is advocating for additional funding for a policy that his party don't agree with. So I'm not necessarily convinced of I'm not convinced necessarily, Presiding Officer, of the intent behind the question here. I think it's worthwhile pointing out that this investment is coming from the Scottish Government at a time when our young people have been deprived of opportunities through Brexit. I hope that Mr Rennie's party will reconsider their position on Brexit, and we can perhaps work together to encourage the UK Government to think again in relation to Erasmus+.
Question number 4, Ross Greer.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government how it ensured that the views and experiences of young people, in particular LGBTQ young people, were reflected in the new draft guidance, delivery of relationships, sexual health and parenthood education in Scottish schools.
Cabinet Secretary.
The views and experiences expressed by children and young people through the Young Scot and Scottish Youth Parliament reports on personal and social education have informed the work to develop the revised draft strategy RSHP teaching guidance. The draft guidance was influenced by the work of the LGBTI Inclusive Education Working Group, as well as a wider range of other stakeholders. The Scottish Government is currently consulting publicly on the revised draft guidance. This includes specific engagement to gather views of young people on whether the revised teaching guidance meets their learning needs. Officials will take into account this activity in developing the final version of the teaching guidance, which is due to be published in the new year.
Ross Greer.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. I was on the Education Committee when we received evidence from queer young people in particular who told us that they resorted to watching porn to learn about sex because the education they received in school was so poor and not remotely LGBTQ inclusive. The new draft Relationship, Sexual Health and Parenthood guidance is a vast improvement on its 2014 predecessor on both LGBTQ inclusion and on key themes such as consent. That's to the credit of young people in groups like the Youth Parliament and TIE campaign. LGBTQ young people were key to producing this draft, and having their confidence will be key to its successful delivery. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how the Government is maximising opportunities for them to provide final feedback during this consultation phase before it is put into use?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to the member for his support in the development of the revised guidance. As I mentioned, we are running an engagement project to gather young people's views. The Scottish Youth Parliament and Young Scot will facilitate face-to-face sessions with representative groups of young people and run a survey to seek their views on the revised guidance. This will run in tandem with the public consultation and will be reflected in the final version of the teaching guidance, which will be published in the new year. LGBT young people are also encouraged to contribute where they can or to engage with representative organisations like LGBT Youth Scotland, Stonewall Scotland or LGBT Health and Wellbeing to help them contribute to the consultation. I was very pleased to be able to see some of the benefits of the TIE campaign's hard work when I visited Castleton Primary School recently. I was delighted to be able to make a presentation to Castleton to mark their achievement on becoming the first school in Scotland to successfully and fully implement LGBT inclusive education. And I enjoyed seeing young people's pride in showing me how their school was an inclusive and supportive environment for all of their pupils.
Thank you. Question number 5, Rachel Hamilton.
To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on whether equivalent measures in Scotland are needed to those introduced in England and Wales by the Equipment Theft Prevention Act 2023 in light of the reports of a recent spate of thefts in the Scottish borders.
Cabinet Secretary Angela Constant.
Presiding Officer, the theft of agricultural plant and machinery is a significant concern to our rural communities and can have serious consequences for the agricultural sector in terms of cost and confidence. And we continue to work with the Scottish Partnership Against Rural Crime and others in our efforts to tackle organised crime and the serious harm it causes to our communities.
Rachel Hamilton.
Whilst Scotland saw a decrease in the cost of rural crime, we cannot stand still. World events have triggered new illicit markets, creating more demand for stolen machinery. Thefts of quad bikes, trailers, farm machinery and GPS trackers are hitting our rural communities hard. The Westminster Equipment Theft Bill was welcomed with open arms by victims of this crime. So will the Cabinet Secretary support my plans to bring forward a similar bill here in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the member is quite correct to say that despite the decrease in the cost of this particular crime to Scotland, that nonetheless that we cannot and must not stand still. I am very excited on the fact that this type of theft has very obvious links to serious and organised crime. I look forward to the member publishing her bill, and can I reassure her that in terms of the private member's bill that was recently passed in Westminster, that we are indeed looking at that closely. That private member's bill now has royal assent. It will come into force south of the border in 6 months' time, and the relevant Secretary of State will be able to introduce regulations, and we will indeed be looking very closely at those regulations and to see how that will inform our thinking for Scotland going forward.
Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you. Can I ask what the Cabinet Secretary's response is to the latest set of statistics which show that recorded crime is at one of its lowest levels in 50 years?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, these continued low levels of crime are due to the efforts across police and justice and community safety partners to deliver safer communities, and of course is due to our investment in the justice system. With recorded crime remaining at one of the lowest levels seen since 1974, the latest figures show reductions in crimes such as violence, damage and reckless behaviour. But nonetheless, we continue to focus on crime prevention, reducing reoffending and supporting victims of crime.
Question number 6, Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the recent summit on tackling violence in schools.
Cabinet Secretary Jenny Gilruth.
As I confirmed in the Chamber last week, there are multiple strands to the Behaviour in School Summit. In June, I convened the first meeting of the Head Teacher Task Force, which focused on issues surrounding school exclusion. On the 5th of September, I chaired a summit that focused on the recording and monitoring of incidents in schools, an area of concern that was raised during the recent parliamentary debate. And the next 2 events are scheduled for October and November. That approach enables engagement with a wide range of stakeholders so that we can hear and learn from the broadest possible range of interests and experiences. It also allows for the key issues to be explored in depth and for the work to be informed by the evidence from the Behaviour in Scottish Schools research, which will be published in November.
Fulton McGregor.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response, and I appreciate her taking the time yesterday to chat to me about this constituent issue. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that an assault took place on a teacher in Copenhagen High School this month. Although the school is out with my constituency of Coatbridge and Chryson, the victim is a constituent of mine and has asked me to raise her case here in our Parliament. I am told that this was a very serious assault, and my constituent is still off work just now. I also know that the vast majority of pupils in Scotland are not likely to commit such acts. So can I therefore ask, what assurances can the Scottish Government give that the recent summit looked carefully at the issue of violence against teachers, as well as pupil-on-pupil violence, and what further policy implementations can be introduced to prevent others experiencing the same as my constituent did?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I'm very sorry to hear about the incident that Mr McGregor has outlined today. Whilst I cannot comment on the specifics of the case in question, no teacher should suffer verbal or physical abuse in their place of work. The work of the Behaviour and Relationships Summit is concerned with ensuring that our schools are safe and consistent environments for all. That includes staff as well as pupils. The next 2 events that I outlined in October and November have a particular focus on this, and the November Summit will benefit from that research being brought forward in relation to the behaviour in Scottish schools research. The BISA research will give us the accurate national picture on behaviour in Scotland's schools, and it's important we have that granular detail, Presiding Officer. Press reports are no substitute to that end. I think we also need to be mindful of the ongoing impacts of the pandemic on behaviour and relationships in our schools. The BISA research and the wealth of feedback that we are gathering as part of the summit process will give us the evidence base to ensure the right support is in place in our schools to respond to the concerns that have been raised.
Question number 7, Liam MacArthur.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it has plans to engage with Regional Screen Scotland regarding their call for funding for a new screen machine vehicle, in light of concerns that a lack of funding could lead to the end of the service.
Cabinet Secretary Angus Robertson.
Yes, I do. I'm meeting with Regional Screen Scotland on the 5th of October to hear directly about the challenges facing the future of the screen machine. I recognise the valuable role that screen machine plays in bringing cinema to rural communities for whom access to culture is limited, and I note that the £176,000 funding provided by Screen Scotland earlier this year, which is allowing Screen Machine Scotland to lease a temporary replacement cinema until April 2024.
Liam MacArthur.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response? Yesterday, the First Minister told the conveners group of the importance of opening up cultural opportunities to people in communities around Scotland. Over the past 25 years, the Screen Machine has done just that in the Highlands and Islands. I declare an interest sitting in the Screen Machine outside Sandy School, one of the North Isles in Orkney, watching George Clooney battling the perfect storm, while an actual storm raged outside, is one of those cinematic experiences you do not forget. So I welcome the engagement the Cabinet Secretary has had, but I'd encourage him to support the further and the future of this valuable cultural asset to the Highlands and Islands.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I thank Liam MacArthur for sharing the positive impact of mobile cinema in the communities that he represents in Orkney, and I would encourage any other colleagues right across the chambers who have similar experiences, I'm sure there's many of them, if they'd be so kind as to forward information on that before the meeting that I hold at the beginning of next month. I think it's very material to the discussions we're having about the future of that service, which is much valued.
I call Alistair Allen.
The Screen Machine is a much cherished service, as we've heard, for people who would otherwise have to travel hundreds of miles to get to static cinema. Does the Cabinet Secretary share my view that this popular and well-used cultural service must be able to access the relevant support to commission a new, greener vehicle which will allow it to visit our rural and island communities?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I'm absolutely clear on the value that Screen Machine brings to the communities that it visits, including the Western Isles, and the esteem in which it's held by its audiences, as well as its contribution to cutting carbon emissions through reduced audience travel. These are all matters which will be subject to the meetings that I'll be holding early next month.
Thank you. And that concludes general questions. Before we move to First Minister's questions, I invite members to join me in welcoming to the gallery His Excellency Mr Vikram Doraiswamy, High Commissioner of India to the United Kingdom. Thank you. The next item of business is First Minister's questions, and at question number 1, I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This week, Margaret McCall from Lanarkshire described her ordeal when she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She faced a 3-month wait for NHS treatment in Scotland, and Margaret didn't know if she had that long. So she used £27,000 of her life savings for faster private treatment in England. Margaret said this: "Cancer kills if left untreated, and the Scottish Government is allowing this to happen. We shouldn't have to go to London or elsewhere." First Minister, Margaret's right, isn't she?
First Minister.
Margaret is right that nobody should have to feel that their only option is to pay privately to go anywhere else outside of Scotland for cancer treatment. And can I pass on my sympathy to Margaret for what is an unacceptable ordeal that she has had to go through. If I can try to give some context, I know Douglas Ross and indeed others in this chamber and outside of this chamber are aware of the significant impact that the COVID pandemic had on our health services right across the UK, including on cancer services. I think one of the most difficult decisions this government had to take during that COVID period was, for example, to have to pause cancer screening, for a period of a number of months, and we are still dealing with the impacts of that difficult decision. In terms of ovarian cancer more specifically, let me try to offer some assurance, if I can, in terms of the latest figures, that in Scotland 94.7% of women, so over 9 out of 10 women, are receiving their first treatment for ovarian cancer within 31 days of a decision to treat. That's as per the latest figures. But in those situations where that is not happening or has not happened in the case of Margaret, then I fully accept Douglas Ross's proposition that that's not an acceptable state of affairs.
Douglas Ross.
The First Minister, as I thought he would, mentions COVID, but they had COVID in England as well, where Margaret got treatment because she could pay £27,000 for that. She went south of the border to get it. And the First Minister wanted to offer his reassurance to ovarian cancer sufferers. So let's look at what Target Ovarian Cancer has said. They say Scotland has one of the worst survival rates in Europe for this cancer. People need urgent treatment to save their lives, but in the SNP-run NHS, they wait months. And Margaret is worried about what happens if her cancer comes back. And she's also worried for people who don't have life savings to pay for treatment. Public Health Scotland statistics show that people from the most deprived areas of Scotland are 74% more likely to die from cancer than those in wealthier areas. So, First Minister, what are people meant to do if they get cancer and they can't afford to go out with Scotland for their treatment?
First Minister.
Well, the NHS in Scotland will be there to assist and to and treat where they possibly can. Unless I misunderstood Douglas Ross, and I'm willing to correct the record if I did, my understanding is that in Margaret's case she went for private treatment in England. So, of course, the services in NHS England are also being impacted, as have the services in NHS Wales, as have the services undoubtedly in NHS Scotland. Douglas Ross is absolutely within his right to ask the question around ovarian cancer. I'm more than happy, given the time limits that we have in First Minister's questions, to write with him with far more detail. But we are taking the issue around ovarian cancer specifically, as he's asked about that, with the utmost seriousness. The Scottish Cancer Network, excuse me, Presiding Officer, will be establishing a new ovarian cancer clinical network which will ensure equity of access to treatment for all women with ovarian cancer, and that's specific to the point that Douglas Ross raises around the inequality that may exist in relation to accessibility of services. We've also committed £10.5 million to health boards to improve capacity and access to systemic anti-cancer therapy by 2027, with £3 million of additional funding released this year. As I say, there is a lot more I can say in terms of detail of what we're doing specifically around ovarian cancer, but in the interest of brevity, I will write to Douglas Ross with that further detail.
Douglas Ross.
Well, I'll welcome that response when it comes, and I'll share it with another member of the public we've spoken to. We spoke to Irene Hartshorn from Ayr, and she was told she needed to wait 12 weeks for ovarian cancer surgery. She told us this morning, and these are Irene's words, "I felt powerless. You know that all the time the illness is getting worse and worse. If I had waited, I think I would be dead by now." Her sister paid for her to get treatment in London, but Irene wanted us to ask the First Minister this question. First Minister, why are the resources not in place in Scotland for this kind of treatment that Irene had to go south of the border for?
First Minister.
Well, we are investing in our National Health Service. That's why this year we gave an additional £1 billion to the Health Service, taking it to £19 billion. So we are not just investing in the Health Service, but importantly investing in the people that provide the treatment. It's why we assured that we did everything we possibly can to ensure that they were paid fairly and that we didn't lose any days on the NHS to industrial action. In terms of staffing as well, under the SNP, there's been an almost 100% increase in consultant oncologists since we took power. So we are investing in the individuals in our health service. We are investing in ensuring there's early detection of cancer as well with our rapid cancer diagnostic services. And we are specifically on ovarian cancer, as that's been an issue that's been raised by Douglas Ross. We are seeking to do what more to explore what more we can do for faster treatment. I go back to the latest statistics that were published, which I hope provide some assurance, though I accept fully their cold comfort for those who've already had to pay for treatment, but to provide some level of reassurance. The latest statistics show that 94.7%, almost 95% of women are receiving their first treatment for ovarian cancer within 31 days of a decision to treat, and we want to consider what more we can do to improve that figure further.
Douglas Ross.
Those answers will be so bitterly disappointing for Margaret and Irene and hundreds of others that are so distressed at having to pay so much money to go out with Scotland to get their treatment. But experts are echoing exactly what the patients are telling us. Dr Hume of Cancer Research UK said the problems in cancer care are fixable if the new cancer strategy is fully funded and implemented now. But the evidence shows that the resources are not in place. And official statistics this week showed that 1 in 4 Scottish patients suspected of having cancer don't start their treatment within the 62-day target. And a new Freedom of Information request that we've had answered shows that one patient in NHS Grampian this year has waited 156 days, more than 5 months to start chemotherapy. Humza Yousaf was Health Secretary for 2 years and cancer waiting times grew. He's now First Minister. What's he going to do to sort it?
First Minister.
Well, as I have referenced, the 31-day cancer stat has improved in terms of the previous quarter. So that's showing, I hope, a journey of recovery that we're absolutely on. And we have to accept that recovery will take a number of years. Douglas Ross made a few points, actually a number of them of which I agree with, and he was reading on behalf of those who work in the NHS, that the cancer strategy, the 10-year strategy that we have published, must be fully funded. We agree. We accept that very premise and that very point. So that's why, for example, this year we've increased our investment in the health service quite substantially. And of course, later this year we'll give an update for our budget 24-25. But I accept fully the premise that the strategies we bring forward must be funded. I also accept the point that the 62-day target must be improved. There is no doubt that that has been impacted and affected by the pandemic, but there frankly was challenges around the 62-day target
pre-pandemic too, and that's why the cancer plan, the cancer strategy we have, will seek to target those cancers, those cancer types that we know we've traditionally struggled with in relation to the 62-day target. So from a Scottish Government perspective, we'll continue that record investment in the NHS. We'll make sure our staff are paid fairly, and we'll make sure we continue to have adequate staffing within our health service. But let me give an absolute assurance, not just to Douglas Ross, but to all of those who are watching and listening, that the treatment of cancer, early diagnosis and then the early treatment of cancer is an absolute #1 priority for the government that I lead.
Question number 2, Anas Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, cancer remains Scotland's biggest killer, and we know there is a direct link between speed of diagnosis, treatment and survival rates. This week, statistics revealed that 1 in 4 cancer patients had faced delays in treatment. That is 1,130 people starting treatment late in the last 3 months alone. Everyone a son or daughter, everyone a loved one, someone loved by a family waiting anxiously. In fact, none of Scotland's health boards met the 62-day standard for starting cancer treatment. Macmillan have warned that staff are stretched to breaking point, and Cancer Research UK called the delays unacceptable. So does the First Minister agree with the experts, or has his government become complacent in the fight against Scotland's biggest killer?
First Minister.
We absolutely haven't become complacent. I hope we can demonstrate that through the work we've done with key stakeholders in relation to the cancer strategy. Douglas Ross and Anas Sarwar are both absolutely right to raise what is a crucial issue for people right across Scotland. Let me in turn try to give some assurances. We are recovering from a global pandemic. That global pandemic has absolutely had an impact, not just on our health service, but of our cancer services. But if I look at the statistics and the figures, when I look at, for example, the 62-day pathway, we are treating 41.2% more patients on that pathway than we did 10 years ago. And if I look at the 31-day pathway for which there has been an improvement, we are treating 19.6% more patients than we did 10 years ago. So we are seeing more patients. The throughput has increased over the last decade. That's not complacency at all, because there's clearly more to do, particularly around the 62-day pathway. Anas Sarwar also raises the importance of diagnostic waiting times. And again, the latest statistics show an improvement in that regard. So we're not complacent. We'll continue to invest. And as I've said already, we'll continue to invest in ensuring that we have the adequate staff so that we can get treatment to people as early as they possibly can.
Anas Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, COVID started 3 years ago. This government has not met the 62-day standard for 11 years. So cut the complacency and cut the excuses. Because we know that every delay risks lives. And we know that cancer deaths are higher than they should be. So far this year, there have been 398 more cancer deaths than experts would have expected. Avoidable and unnecessary deaths. And this week, it was also revealed that life expectancy in Scotland has dropped again. It's fallen back to a level not seen for over 10 years. There is no starker indication of failure than that. So will the First Minister take this opportunity to apologise for the lost decade on the SNP's watch?
First Minister.
Of course, when people don't get the treatment as quickly as they should, or where targets are missed, then of course the government not just apologises, we have deep regret when that is the case. Of course, Anas Sarwar forgets to mention the fact that what has happened over the last decade is over a decade of Westminster austerity, which we know every single external organisation that has an interest in poverty will tell you that poverty is a clear determinant, is a clear factor of health inequality. So we will do our best to try to mitigate the impact of that Westminster austerity, and we have put hundreds of millions of pounds from our budgets on the table to protect from that Westminster austerity. But in terms of what we're doing in relation to the NHS, I go back to the central point. Record investment, ensuring we pay our staff fairly, hence why there haven't been strikes in Scotland where there have been in health services across the UK, including in Wales and in England. And we'll continue to invest in our staff and ensure that patients get the treatment they deserve as quickly as they possibly deserve.
Anas Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister doesn't need to persuade me on how woeful the UK Tory government is, but that doesn't excuse the woeful record of this SNP government for the last 16 years. Every cancer delay raises the chance of avoidable death, and that's why patients should be diagnosed and start treatment in 62 days. But the FOI request has revealed the dire reality for too many patients. Some cancer patients have waited 191 days for diagnosis and treatment. 191 days. A cervical cancer patient waited 217 days. A prostate cancer patient waited 334 days. And there was even a cancer patient that waited 385 days for diagnosis and to start treatment. You can't blame somebody else somewhere else for that. That is the SNP's record. Over a year of anxiety before getting the help those cancer patients needed. So why can't the First Minister see what many on his own benches can see, that the SNP have lost their way, have got complacent and no longer put the interests of the Scottish people first?
First Minister.
That is simply untrue, and that is why, when it comes to who is trusted with the NHS, we tend to leave that verdict to the people of Scotland. The people of Scotland, time and time again, have given that verdict to the SNP, and I can hear Anas Sarwar shouting something about polls, and of course in most of these polls, if not every single one of them, the SNP continue to lead Labour and continue to lead other political parties too, and the reason for that, after 16 years in government, is because of our stewardship of vital public services like the NHS. And let me just remind Anas Sarwar of a couple of points, because I'm not disagreeing with the central premise that neither he nor Douglas Ross have raised, that there has to be improvements in the 62-day standard. And I agree with that, and I accept that. And there obviously has undoubtedly been an impact from COVID. But as things stand, we have seen an improvement in the 62-day standard compared to the previous quarter, where over 7 out of 10 patients are starting treatment within that 62-day standard. It has to be improved, so there is no complacency. And the median wait in relation to the 62-day standard was 49 days. So we'll continue on that journey of recovery. We'll continue to invest in our health service, continue to invest in our staffing, and we'll continue to do what we can to ensure that patients, the public, are seen and treated as quickly as they possibly can.
Question number 3, Liz Smith.
To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking in response to reports of widespread contamination at many of Scotland's outdoor swimming sites.
First Minister.
I would take some exception to the use of the term widespread, Presiding Officer, but the Scottish Government is committed to improving water quality at bathing waters across Scotland. Recent reporting of these statistics has not interpreted SEPA's bathing water monitoring data correctly. Since we introduced more stringent European standards in 2015, we've worked with SEPA, Scottish Water and key stakeholders to ensure there are now more bathing waters classified as good or excellent than ever before, with 98% meeting the water quality standards. Scottish Water is working to install monitors on all its sewer outfalls in or near bathing waters to provide near real-time spill data by December of next year. These actions will help inform bathers and support SEPA and Scottish Water's work to prioritise investment where it will most benefit both our environment and our communities.
Liz Smith.
Thank you. I'm a bit surprised by that answer, First Minister, because the most recent investigations at Lower Largo in Fife, which tells it that it's the most polluted beach in Scotland, it breached the regulations on 7 occasions so far in 2023, and on 3 occasions it was 50 times the contamination limit, which is a very serious health hazard. So can I ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government is going to do to increase the frequency of the checks on these beaches? And can I also ask the First Minister if he is as concerned as I am about the number of community swimming pool closures, which are obviously seen by many families as a safer alternative just now?
First Minister.
What I say to Liz Smith is, of course, the situation that she mentions in relation to Lower Largo. I know it is, of course, a serious one, and my understanding is that there are identified reasons for that potential contamination. I know it's an issue that Scottish Water and SEPA are looking at very seriously. I'm happy to write to Liz Smith and ensure that the appropriate Cabinet Secretary writes to Liz Smith with the detail of what actions are being taken in that specific example. But I do go back to the point and why I took exception to Liz Smith suggesting that contamination was widespread is that point that 98% of Scotland's bathing waters currently achieve the bathing water quality standard, with more being rated excellent than ever before. So we do have good monitoring, we do have good quality of water here in Scotland, and on specifics of Lower Largo, I'm more than happy to write to Liz Smith with the detail.
Willie Rennie.
I have to say I'm astonished by the answer from the First Minister. It's astonishingly complacent. 50 out of 89 of the most popular beaches in Scotland are beyond safe standards for bathing. That should be an alarm bell for the First Minister. So when is he going to implement the proper measurement of all sewage outflows? And when, at last, is he going to set legally binding targets to end the sewage dumping?
First Minister.
This is an issue that Scottish Water and SEPA take seriously. I've given the answer in previous First Minister's questions around how, for example, that water is being monitored, how the sewage outflows are being monitored, in a comprehensive monitoring programme that has cost considerable amounts of public investment has been underway over the last number of years. And of course there is action to increase that monitoring over the period to come, again, which I'm happy to give more detail to Willie Rennie. So nobody is complacent here. I'm fully accepting that there are particular instances that must be investigated, where there must be action that is taken. But I go back to that point that 98% of the bathing waters currently achieve that quality standard, with more being rated as excellent than ever before. But on the specifics that Willie Rennie raises, I'm more than happy to provide him and furnish him with answers in detail around what further monitoring is expected to take place.
Faisal Chowdhury.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've raised before the issue of sewage contamination in Scotland's water, notably in the water of Fleet in my region. I previously asked the Scottish Government for a meeting, but in August, the Cabinet Secretary advised me that she did not think a meeting would be useful. Will the Cabinet Secretary now agree to meet with me urgently, considering the clear severity of the issue across Scotland?
First Minister.
I'm more than happy, of course, to consider that meeting and ensure that the Cabinet Secretary considers that meeting. In terms of outflow monitoring, Scottish Water has carried out a more comprehensive Scotland-wide environmental study programme to assess the impacts of its assets on water quality, and that was during the period 2015 to 2021. That investment period costing £40 million, and the computer models Scottish Water developed allows it to understand when those combined sewer outflows will spill, under what rain conditions, and the impact that those spills will have on the environment. SEPA regularly monitors the water environment to ensure that it's not impacted by sewage spills, and in 2019 it took 19,000 monitoring samples across Scotland to safeguard the water quality of our rivers, our lochs and our coastal areas. So significant amount of monitoring that goes into those overflows. But of course, given Faisal Chowdhury's question, I'm more than happy that the Government will give consideration to a meeting if you would find that useful.
Thank you. Question number 4, Christine Grahame.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to some members of the judiciary expressing opposition to juryless rape trials.
First Minister.
The Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill includes proposals for a time-limited pilot of judge-only rape trials. The Senators of the Colleges of Justice response clearly sets out that they do have split views on the proposal. Organisations including Rape Crisis Scotland, Victim Support Scotland, Scottish Women's Aid, we know that they support the pilot. They, like many, they're concerned at the experiences of complainers, the influence of rape myths and the lower conviction rates of rape. The Senator's response states, and I will quote directly, that there is a serious problem with what happens in jury trials for rape cases, end quote. The pilot stems from the recommendations, of course, by Lady Dorien, as I know Christine Grahame is aware of. She is, of course, Scotland's second most senior judge. And as part of that report and review into how we improve the justice system, particularly for victims and survivors of rape, while also, and this is crucial, protecting the rights of the accused too.
Christine Grahame.
I thank the First Minister for his answer. I too have read the submissions from the Senators, both for and against, and I'm not quoting, but I'll paraphrase. There is the evidential difficulty that most alleged victims and the accused were in a relationship, sometimes even after the alleged crime, and that may influence the low conviction rate no matter what we use. The right to a fair trial under the European Convention of Human Rights, which is embedded in the Scotland Act, as this may affect the accused. And I think, crucially, as the government, I understand, is to assess the efficacy of this pilot, for me this trespasses on the principle of the separation of powers of legislature and judiciary, an extremely serious issue. So will the First Minister confirm there will be robust scrutiny of this proposal, that his government has an open mind as reflecting on these concerns and indeed my concerns?
First Minister.
Yes, of course we will be open-minded in our consideration of the legislation. And that's why the committee stage of this bill, the evidence-gathering stage of this bill, is such a crucial part of the legislative process. It allows us to hear quite robustly, often quite powerfully, the various arguments being put forward. And I do go back to my point, of course, that this recommendation for a time-limited pilot of juryless trials is coming from a review conducted by the second most senior judge, a very experienced judge, I think a judge who commands respect right across the political chamber, as Lady Dorian does. And therefore, it's important we do give that weight, as we do also give weight to those voices who have expressed concern, not just the judiciary, but we know many members of the legal profession too. So we will, of course, give that weight. We will also give the voice of victims and survivors weight in this decision and the passage of this bill too. And we do need to improve the experience of rape complainers. I think all of us absolutely accept that. I think all of us would also accept the rape myths that do exist within juries as well. And maybe I'll end with a quote from Rape Crisis Scotland, which has stayed with me since my days as Justice Secretary and to this very day. And I quote them, that many survivors described the process of going to court more traumatic than the rape itself. That is an unacceptable position in any justice system, let alone ours.
Ivan McKee.
The case for juryless trials in rape cases often cites the work undertaken by Professor Fiona Lerwick and her 2020 report on juries and rape myths. However, that report concludes by stating, before suggesting anything as drastic as removing juries from criminal trials, however, it is worth considering whether the answer might lie in addressing problematic attitudes via juror education. This, it is argued in the report, is the way forward before more radical measures are considered. Does the First Minister agree?
First Minister.
Yeah, I think it's not a case of just doing either or. I think it's absolutely acceptable to explore both. So I think education, of course, trying to tackle rape myths in society more generally is something that is incumbent upon us to do in government, but also to consider the pilot. Ivan McKee was right to reference, I thought, an excellent piece of work, the most comprehensive jury research undertaken, I think, in the entire UK. That work done by Professor Fiona Lerwick, James Chalmers and others. I'm happy to correct the record if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that Professor Lerwick does support the proposal for a pilot. I do welcome steps that the judiciary have taken to improve jury education, and I will highlight the Senators' comments from the Senators testing rape myth directions with juries this year, and I'll quote that when it came to judge directions, they did not prevent acquittals which appear to the trial judge to be conspicuously generous on the evidence adduced. So there is definitely a role for education around rape myths.
Briefly, First Minister.
There is, but there's also the option, I think we should be exploring, juryless trials.
Russell Finlay.
Thank you, President Officer. Lawyers across Scotland say they will boycott the SNP's planned juryless trials, with senior judges also raising concerns that removing jurors constitutes political meddling in the independence of the judiciary by this SNP government. So, as I asked his Justice Secretary yesterday, will Humza Yousaf ignore these concerns, pass his bill and simply hope for the best?
First Minister.
Of course, we will listen to the views of the legal profession. We'll listen to the, of course, weight of opinion of the judiciary. And, of course, we'll give appropriate weight to the voices of victims and survivors too. But I do go back to the central point. I would make this point quite robustly to Russell Findlay, that this pilot or proposal for a pilot of juryless trials is coming from Lady Dorian. It is not government interference by simply exploring a recommendation from the second most senior judge, the Lord Justice Clerk of Scotland. So I think it doesn't do an issue that requires great sensitivity, any justice, where we attempt to throw around terms like political interference, regardless of who that comes from. So I think let's absolutely give consideration to the voices of the judiciary. Let's also not forget the voices of victims and survivors in this issue too.
Absolutely. Question number 5, Sue Webber.
To ask the First Minister what assessment the Scottish Government has made of the use of antidepressants in Scotland.
First Minister.
I understand the impact and suffering depression can cause sufferers and their families. I'm committed to improving care, support and access to treatment. It's important that we recognise many people in Scotland benefit from the use of antidepressant therapy. We established a short-life working group on prescription medicine and withdrawal, which reviewed antidepressants use across Scotland and involved clinical stakeholders and people with lived experience. In response to this group's recommendations, we will shortly publish a prescribing guide on antidepressants. This provides practical and evidence-driven guidelines on safe and effective prescribing through promotion of person-centred medicine reviews.
Sue Webber.
First Minister, the number of adults and young people being prescribed antidepressants has significantly increased over the last 10 years to over 1 million. Prescriptions are for a wide range of disorders and illnesses. At the same time, the NHS mental health spending as a percentage has declined between 2011 and 2022. Does the First Minister accept that there is clearly a link between the failure to access mental health services and the subsequent increase in prescriptions? Patients are asking for more than pills. What will ministers do to provide this critical access to mental health services?
First Minister.
I cannot be the only one who listened to that question that is really disturbed by the insinuation that antidepressants are not a legitimate treatment for those who require it. And they can also be a part of a treatment. It doesn't mean that people only have access to medicine or only have access to, for example, psychological therapies. For many people, there will be...
Let's hear the First Minister.
There will be a mixture of both. In terms of our mental health investment, I'm proud of this government's record of investment in mental health services over the last number of years. Significant increases, not just in mental health services, but crucially in mental health staffing. And I'm more than happy to ensure that the Minister writes to Sue Webber with detail of that. And let me end by saying this, that ultimately these are clinical decisions, and we should leave it for clinicians, not for politicians, to decide who is prescribed antidepressants and who is not.
Paul Sweeney.
Presiding Officer, research from the Royal College of Psychiatrists released today has shown that 58% of people in Scotland think that mental health services receive too little of the healthcare budget. And by the Scottish Government's own measure, that 58% of people are correct, aren't they? This government commitment of 10% to be spent on mental health as part of the overall healthcare budget is not being met, with just 8.7% being allocated currently. In cash terms, that means we are £180 million a year short. So will the First Minister confirm if that 10% target for mental health spending is still a priority for his government? And if so, how will he personally ensure that it is met?
First Minister.
It is still our aim, our ambition and our target. And since 2007, mental health spending has doubled in cash terms, from £651 million to £1.3 billion. And if you don't want to take my word for it, if Paul Sweeney doesn't want to take my word for it, if I look at the latest Audit Scotland report in relation to mental health, if I look specifically at paragraph 70 of the report, it says between 2017-18 and 23-24, the Scottish Government's Mental Health Directorate budget increased significantly. That's a direct quote. And again, I'm more than happy for the Minister to furnish Paul Sweeney with further details of the significant investment in recruitment of CAMS staff in particular, and of course the fact that we are seeing record numbers of young people through those services, and I want that to continue, and I want those improvements to continue too.
Question number 6, Kaukab Stewart.
To ask the First Minister whether he will provide an update on the work that the Scottish Government is undertaking to support the establishment of a pilot safer drug consumption facility.
First Minister.
I welcome the decision taken yesterday by the Integrated Joint Board, which, following the position taken by the Lord Advocate in the Safer Drug Consumption Facility proposal, now allows Glasgow to move ahead with this pilot. We've been consistent in our commitment to support the set-up of a safer drug consumption facility, which included facilitating work between Glasgow Health and Social Care Partnership and Police Scotland to develop the proposal that was then submitted to the Lord Advocate. We provided Glasgow with an absolute assurance around funding in advance of yesterday's meeting of Glasgow's Integrated Joint Board to discuss the establishment of such a facility. We'll also continue to play an active role in the planning and implementation work to ensure that the facility is delivered in a timely manner and, of course, fully evaluated too.
Kaukab Stewart.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. Alongside other Glasgow MSPs, I wrote to the Home Secretary regarding this issue last month. The response suggests that the Home Office will not stand in the way of the Lord Advocate's authority on this matter, providing it's exercised lawfully. Whilst welcome, it is disappointing that the UK Government seems unwilling to work with the Scottish Government to actively progress this public health measure. Does the First Minister agree? It appears that the UK's inaction on this matter is a political rather than pragmatic, and that true cooperation from the Home Office on this would help provide even better care and support.
First Minister.
I do agree with Kaukab Stewart. She's right that, of course, the easiest way, the simplest way and the quickest way to have had such a facility up and running would have been, of course, if the Home Office gave approval. I'm not sure why Labour seem to be acting as a human shield for the Conservatives, but what I would say to Labour and Conservative members in this regard is that even with the Lord Advocate's statement of prosecution policy, there are limitations on this pilot. In fact, it can only, the Safer Drug Consumption Facility can only be focused on this narrow pilot in Glasgow. I know there's been calls for other pilots to be established, but we know the statement of prosecution policy is for simple possession offences within this particular pilot. I do welcome the fact that the Home Office and the UK Government have said that they will not stand in the way. I would urge them to take a public health approach to tackling drug deaths, as we have done here in Scotland, and give approval so that we can hopefully use safer drug consumption facilities as one of the tools in a whole range of tools to try to fight what is still unacceptably high levels of drug deaths here in Scotland.
Thank you, First Minister. We move to constituency and general supplementaries, and I call Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In evidence to the Finance Committee, leading economists emphasise how crucial it is for the Scottish Government to invest in Scotland's infrastructure for economies to grow and our living standards improve. What is the First Minister's response to the Auditor-General's report published today that the UK Tory Government is expected to impose, at a time of high interest rates and inflation, a real terms 7% reduction in Scotland's capital block grant over the next 4 years, while the Prime Minister continues to dither over the tens of billions being squandered on the HS2 rail project?
First Minister.
Kenny Gibson is absolutely right to raise the UK Government's cut to our capital budget, that real terms 7% cut to our capital budget, because we know infrastructure investment is absolutely key to securing inclusive economic growth and delivering high-quality public services. We've been consistent about the challenges. We've been very open about the challenges facing our capital investment plans and, of course, the tough decisions that we will need to take in relation to the budget 2024-25. The challenging economic conditions of the last few years, resulting from Brexit, resulting from the disastrous mini-budget, and the UK Government not inflation-proofing the capital budget, has resulted in that 7% real terms fall in our Barnett capital funding over the medium term. We will, of course, look at what innovative finance models we can use to power that investment, infrastructure investment, in the years to come. But that job has been made considerably harder by that 7% real term cut from the UK Government.
Sharon Dowie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A fire has devastated the former Station Hotel in Ayr, causing massive disruption to the rail network in the south-west of Scotland. I'd like to put on record my thanks to the firefighters who fought this fire and all other emergency workers involved. It is crucial Ayr Station is opened as soon as possible. Can I ask the First Minister what financial help the Scottish Government will give stakeholders to help pay for the substantial cost they face to make the area safe and reopen this vital rail network?
First Minister.
Can I thank Sharon Dowie for her question and add my appreciation for our emergency services, in particular Scottish Fire and Rescue, who battled not just throughout the night but into the next day in order to ensure that this fire was under control. And they have always had my utmost respect, and that has only increased after the events in terms of Ayr Station Hotel. The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service have remained in attendance, but there's no further signs of fire. The site should be handed over to South Ayrshire Council. My understanding is today. ScotRail, as Sharon Dowie may know, have introduced alternative arrangements with an emergency timetable and train service running from Prestwick Town, supported by the replacement bus transport. In terms of the direct question that Sharon Dowie asks, of course the Government will be open to discussions around what support we can provide in order to not just secure the site, but to make sure that services are running as close to normal as they possibly can.
Claire Baker.
Thank you. The First Minister may be aware that tenants and homeowners were moved out of their homes in Tillicoultry on Tuesday evening because of safety concerns after the identification of rack in the roof of their block of flats. This is clearly very upsetting and worrying for my constituents. Can I ask what discussion the Scottish Government is having with Clackmannanshire Council following the identification of rack in these homes, whether financial assistance will be made available to local authorities and registered social landlords who discover rack, and what assistance and advice can be given to homeowners who find themselves in this situation?
First Minister.
My thoughts very much are with the families who've had to leave their homes. I recognise the impact this will have on them. I commend the very quick action taken by Clackmannanshire Council to make sure these households are safe, and there is very regular dialogue between the Scottish Government and COSLA on the issue of RAC. Assessments of risks related to RAC are very much underway across the housing sector, and information will be provided as it becomes available. We are working closely with housing stakeholders to ensure the necessary action is being taken where risks are identified. Claire Baker will know from previous ministerial statements given as an update to RAC that we haven't received any additional funding from the UK Government in relation to RAC. But of course, if there are additional financial requests for funding in relation to dealing with RAC from local authorities, we will give that due consideration.
Fergus Ewing.
Presiding Officer, in the programme for Government, the First Minister reaffirmed the welcome commitment to dual the A96 as between Inverness and Aldern, including the Nairn bypass. In November last year, the then Transport Secretary assured this chamber that the necessary statutory orders, compulsory purchase and ancillary roads would be made in a matter of weeks. Nearly a year later, my constituents, Presiding Officer, are still waiting. Will the First Minister therefore ask the Transport Secretary to bring an oral statement to Parliament to explain why there has been such a further delay? The good people of Nairn, and indeed of the whole of the north of Scotland, are surely entitled to know what is or is not going on.
First Minister.
The people of Inverness and, of course, of Nairn are absolutely due an update, and I'm more than happy to consider a ministerial statement, but perhaps, if it's more appropriate, an update, a written update to the member, to other members who've got an interest in relation to the A96. And our, of course, commitment remains, our manifesto commitment remains, the dualling of the 96, in particular the Inverness to Nairn bypass. For reasons that are known to Fergus Ewing, there is a review outside of the Inverness to Nairn section. There is a review of options that is being taken place for a number of reasons, including our commitments to climate obligations. But Fergus Ewing is absolutely right. We are duty-bound to give updates to members of the public in relation to our infrastructure projects, including the A96. So I will give consideration to the ask that Fergus Ewing makes and decide what is the most appropriate way to update him, members of this chamber and members of the public, on our latest plans in relation to the A96.
Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Very tragically, last year there were 174 fatalities on Scotland's roads. That's increased 23% year on year, and it's actually at its highest level since 2016. I'm sure many of us in this chamber and our constituents have been touched by many of these tragic accidents. But, First Minister, that's also against the backdrop of a 14% drop in police road traffic officers over the last decade. Many prominent road safety campaigners say there clearly is a link, as does the Scottish Police Federation. Does the First Minister share my concerns and the concerns of road safety campaigners about these tragic statistics, and what is the Scottish Government going to do about them?
First Minister.
I absolutely agree with Jamie Green that any life lost is tragic, and my condolences go out to every single family, every single community that's been impacted by a death on our roads. What I would say to Jamie Green is, when it comes to Police Scotland, we have, of course, increased funding to Police Scotland this financial year, significant increase to Police Scotland in terms of their resource budget, and of course we'll continue to consider what more we can do to support Police Scotland. But we also know that interventions, capital interventions on our roads can be quite important, whether that's signage, whether that's the appropriate speed cameras, whether it's any other intervention, and we'll consider what more we can do to make our roads as safe as possible. We have very ambitious targets in relation to reducing those deaths on our roads, and I'll ensure that the Cabinet Secretary writes to Jamie Green with further detail on action we're taking in this regard.
And Mark Ruskell.
Thank you. Yesterday's decision by the UK Government to grant a licence to the Rosebank oil and gas field is nothing short of a climate catastrophe, condemning us to a future dependent on fossil fuels whilst the planet around us burns. It shows utter contempt for both our environment and the future generations who will live with the consequences. Will the First Minister join me in condemning this decision? And can he confirm if the UK Government carried out the climate compatibility assessment needed before this licence was granted?
First Minister.
Well, I've gone on record to say that I think it's the wrong decision to approve Rosebank at a time when the world is literally on fire, when the planet is burning, when we have seen the most devastating impacts of the climate catastrophe. Instead of showing climate leadership, what we have from the UK Government is complete and utter climate denial, Presiding Officer. And Scotland's future, the North East future, is as the net zero capital. It's not as the oil and gas capital. It's transitioning from that to a net zero capital. That's the future I want to see for
Members,
the North
let's hear the
East.
First Minister.
And that's why we have, of course, invested £500 million in that Just Transition Fund. So while the Conservatives believe in unlimited oil and gas extraction, infinite oil and gas extraction, we believe in a greener, more sustainable future for Scotland. And as ever, the Conservatives on this issue, as with many other issues, will be on the wrong side of history, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. That concludes First Minister's questions. Point of order, Douglas Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, during our members' debate on the 31st of May, John Swinney intervened to say I was incorrect to state that UK swimming pool funding from the Treasury was in addition to the Scottish budget. Mr Swinney has now admitted to me that he was wrong, apologised and corrected the record, and I thank him for that. However, on the 29th of June, I intervened on Minister Siobhan Brown, who's walking away, to state the same basic fact. The Minister responded that Barnett consequentials had already been added to the local authority block. The Minister then wrote to me, apologising and corrected the record, and I thank her for that. Now, yesterday I asked Minister Joe Fitzpatrick about the same UK swimming pool fund. In his response, he stated, as I said, the money has been allocated. It was allocated to budgets as part of £100 million of additional funding that went to local government at Stage 3 of the Budget Bill. Presiding Officer, Stage 3 of the budget was in February, and as John Swinney admitted to me in his apology, the money was allocated by the UK Government much later. For the SNP to make this mistake once was unfortunate. To make this mistake twice looks like incompetence. To make this mistake 3 times looks deliberate. Presiding Officer, can you let me know if Minister Fitzpatrick has made any attempt to correct the record? And can you tell me if there is any action you can take, given the torrent of corrections now being issued by Scottish ministers, when such an important issue that affects our communities across Scotland has been obscured to such an extent. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you for your contribution, Mr Lumsden. I am unaware as to whether or not any attempt to correct the record has been made. It is, of course, all members will agree that it is of paramount importance that members, including ministers, give accurate and truthful information to the Parliament, correcting any inadvertent errors at the earliest opportunity. And if a member has a question about the factual accuracy of another member's contribution, they should raise it with that member. And I'm sure at this point in the term, the Chamber is well aware that the Parliament has a corrections procedure and how that mechanism operates. Thank you. We'll have a short suspension at the moment to allow members to leave the gallery and those members of the public, I should say, leaving the gallery to do so, before we move on to members' business.